Okay, well, let us get started soon here. First of all, welcome everybody. It's always glad to see all these faces again. Certainly appreciate that. And as we may remember from last week, I had promised that we would actually finally get to aircraft today. It's only taken us 10 sessions of this class to get. I know you're excited. I knew you would be. But yes, well, the fact of the matter is aircraft are relatively late in the second industrial revolution, so that is why they appear at this particular point. So, we are going to refer to this class as the aircraft goes to war. So, let us get started today. All right, so since the earliest days, since man's, became cognizant and was around, we've always looked at birds as being something that we really admire, that are symbols of freedom. They live in this three-dimensional world that, that man just is, jealous or envious of this ability to go places in this three-dimension, go in places that are almost virtually impossible for humans to get to. And so I think that the bird is really a symbol of freedom and something that man has always attempted to equal. And it is not until, of course, the second industrial revolution where we begin to find that capability. So we wanted to fly, and we don't have the technology to fly. In the first industrial revolution, indeed, the balloon is available. And we start to see the balloon being used in warfare. We see it as early as right around late Napoleonic times. But the balloon itself is tethered, so it can't really go anywhere. Or if you untether the balloon, it is at the vagaries of the wind. So you can't really control it. So is this really like the flight of a bird? No, of course it's not. But during the second industrial revolution, thanks to the internal combustion engine, we see that people begin to put internal combustion engines onto balloons. And so now you have the capability to at least have some sort of controlled flight. And the first person really to demonstrate this on a very practical basis is a gentleman from Brazil called Alberto Santos Dumont. And he takes a balloon, puts an internal combustion engine onto that balloon, and he flies around the Eiffel Tower in 1901. This causes a huge stir in France. People are like, whoa, this is cool, because now we can actually have controlled flight. But it's still limited because balloons have a lot of issues, particularly with weather, high winds, they're not really usable. So there's lots of problems with balloons in this regard, and we'll see this too in military history. But soon after this, something else occurs, and that is the Wright brothers. They managed to have controlled flight. They managed to have a heavier-than-air aircraft that is controllable. It's not flying very high, as you can see in this picture, but it is two bicycle mechanics, really, two really smart engineers, two people that are capable of using science and engineering together, which are the keystones of the second industrial revolution. And these two people come up with an idea to make this aircraft. And indeed, they are successful. But they owe a lot to birds. The Wright Flyer is really got a lot of bird-like aspects to it. For example, it does not have ailerons. It does not have flaps. It uses a process like a bird flies called wing warping. So actually the wings of the Wright Flyer are capable of actually being flexed. So that is how the Wright Flyer is flown in control. So that's a huge change from what we would expect. But again, they are basing this technology on what they observe as birds. Well, the Wrights are also business people. And they decide that they are going to sell their product. And the first person they really want to sell it to is military people. So by 1909, they They've perfected the aircraft well enough where they can start to sell this to militaries. And the first person, or first government to purchase this thing is the United States Signal Corps, part of the Army and, of course, part of the reconnaissance aspect of the U.S. military. And they buy the Wright Flyer in 1909. So the first people to buy an aircraft for military purposes is indeed the United States. But the United States really doesn't do much with it. They kind of ignore it. And as we'll see, by the time we get to World War I, the United States is well behind the rest of the world, or at least the warring powers, in military aviation capabilities. So when we get to World War I, we'll see that the U.S. actually flies French aircraft for World War I. They do not have any really indigenously produced aircraft until after the war that would be capable of fighting. So the U.S. kind of drops the ball on this. Well, with the realization that heavier-than-air flight is really going to change the nature of warfare. And we saw last week how the submarine would indeed operate in a three-dimensional world. But the submarine only operates in a three-dimensional world in a very, very short time frame because they can't stay underwater long. They can't go very far when they're underwater. But most importantly, the submarine, when it's underwater, is completely blind. They can't see or do anything really except use it as a means to escape. When the submarine raises its periscope in order to have visual capability, again, it has gone into a two-dimensional world because it can't do that and still see, to keep that periscope above water. Aircraft, on the other hand, have vastly more potential because when you're up in the air, you have virtually unlimited vision and you have much greater distances and much faster that you can travel because airplanes are significantly faster and eventually will be able to go much, much further than a submarine could underwater at this time. So an aircraft really is something that can function in a three-dimensional world. But the problem is nobody knows how it's going to fight with this particular thing. How are we going to use an aircraft to fight with it? So that will be a problem that will take quite a while to solve. So at the start of the war, many, many, many of the military, the older particularly military, are not particularly fond of airplanes. They don't see these flimsy craft as being something that's really worthwhile. But what will happen in World War I is we will find out that modern weapons are too powerful for cavalry. So the machine gun versus a horse is not a particularly good thing. So what happens then is the cavalry becomes less and less important, but observation and reconnaissance never loses its value. And so the airplane is going to fill some of that role. So they can at least use the aircraft to find the enemy, find enemy fortifications, etc. Well, so at the beginning of the war, the Germans have a relatively large air fleet. If you see, we have 246 aircraft and 7 referred to as airships. Some of these are Zeppelins, some of these are just basically more like a powered balloon, but we'll just use that as an airship for right now. The French have 160 aircraft, and the, what is it, I believe 13 airships, was it? Yeah, 15 airships. And Britain has 113 aircraft and 6 airships. So these are relatively large amounts of technology for such a quick time. Remember, it's only been primitively capable as of 1903, so by 1914, we see these are getting to be relatively large. The problem with many of these aircraft are they're very, very, very limited and a very limited military value. So, for example, you wouldn't really want to take a Wright Flyer and take it over by a German machine gun nest. It probably wouldn't be a good idea. So by 1911, though, there's a international conference in Madrid, and it's a legal conference, and they are already beginning to explore the fact that the airplane should never be armed, because the airplane is too much of a threat against innocent civilians in cities, and indeed, they would have the situation where this would be against international law to start bombing them. So even before World War I, extremely early, the aircraft is already seen as a danger to civilians and eventually will become a danger to total war. Yes, Judy? Oh, I thought you... Yeah. Okay, so... All right, well, let us talk a little bit about these really early aircraft. And I think there's some things that maybe will be surprising to you, maybe not, but they were, I find them to be incredibly interesting, and maybe that's just me, but all right, so these airplanes are extremely light. They weigh virtually nothing. They are made of wood, they are covered with fabric, and the biggest weight involved with these aircraft is going to be the engine and its fuel. So it becomes very, very important to have engines that are extremely favorable in a power-to-weight ratio. And one of the solutions to this was this particular type of engine, which is called a rotary engine. And it is extremely, here's a very efficient solution to the problem of power output, weight, and reliability. Okay, why is it? Well, the reason it has such a favorable weight ratio is these engines operate very, very differently than we would expect an engine to operate. We expect an engine, and other aircraft, these were primarily used on fighters later in the war. But other aircraft would use what we are familiar with, which is an inline engine or an engine that has a block. So if I have a V engine, I've got a big metal block and the cylinders are in there, they're going like this, right? And they're turning a crankshaft. And that crankshaft is then taking power and putting it into the transmission, for example, for your car. This engine functions extremely differently. This engine, the crankshaft, is solid. It does not turn. And the entire cylinders go around in a circle. So if you think about it, that's a lot of stuff that's moving all at one time. Well, this has some advantages. First of all, you don't have to have a crankcase. Second of all, you don't have to have an oil sump, so you don't have that oil weight. Third, because it's spinning around, it's cooling itself, so I don't need to have a radiator, and so it's air-cooled engine. So it's got a lot of advantages as far as power-to-weight ratio. Now, this Larone 9C has a capability of 80 horsepower. Why don't we see these engines used much today is they have a very, very difficult time getting any more horsepower out of these. By the end of the war, I think they had taken a couple nines and putting them together and had managed to get these things up, some of the very large ones up to a little more than 200 horsepower. That's all they could ever get out of this type of engine. So you see this engine is automatically limited in that way. It has some other very significant disadvantages as well. One of those disadvantages is yes?
How did they increase the horsepower?
Put two together.
Back to back?
Put a 9 and a 9, now you got an 18.
Okay. Okay, so if they got up to 200, if they had that many?
The engines, just because of their design, you got something that big spinning around, you just can't get that much more horsepower out of it. Right. So it's a very inefficient, in that regard, design. So we can get thousands of horsepower out of a block engine. You can't do it with this. There's just too much going on. Yes?
Could you translate horsepower into speed? How fast can 80 horsepower go?
It would, okay, how fast can 80 horsepower go? All right? I will give you a general answer to that. And the general answer would be this. I need to know how heavy the aircraft is. I need to know how efficient the design is and as far as air resistance goes. Generally in World War I, you can assume early on in the war that these things could maybe get to 100 miles an hour. Maybe. Even later in the war, you're looking at maybe 120, 130 miles an hour tops. These things are not fast. Larger bombers, for example, we'll talk about the Gotha, could only go 83 miles an hour. So they're not fast. So these engines are very, very limited. Even V engines at this time were limited. By the end of the war, I think the most powerful V engine available for aircraft was probably in the neighborhood of 220 to 230 horsepower. That's it. Many of you have cars with more horsepower than that. So nothing like World War II with thousands of horsepower. But anyway, they have a very bad fuel. They use a lot of fuel. They have to use a two-cycle system. So basically, the oil and the fuel are mixed together. What they do is they use, because it doesn't blend well with fuel, which is an advantage, they use castor oil. So when you see old engines of this type, you'll see that they are generally stained brown. Okay? And what happens is if you have a tractor-type aircraft where the engine is in front of you, you are continually breathing fumes from this engine, which is laced with castor oil. So the first thing you would do when you would land is you would strip off your flight suit and go to the latrine, because you would have an incredible case of diarrhea. So these are not particularly fun to fly in, but they are very, very efficient for what they needed to do with these incredibly lightweight engines. One other big problem. When you have a propeller turning, you have centrifugal force. So if it's going to the left, when I take off, the plane wants to go to the left. With this engine, I not only have a propeller going around to the left, I have the entire block going around to the left. And you can see that in the top picture. That silver plate is just a solid piece to connect that metal thing that your propeller's attached to, so that that whole thing is going around in a circle. So now I have all this centrifugal force. So at low speeds, well, I can design the airplane when it's in the air to compensate for some of that pull to the left, for example. When that plane is on the ground and I'm trying to take off, or I'm trying to land at extremely slow speed, I don't have that compensation ability from the aircraft. So there are numerous times when these airplanes on takeoff or landing flip over because there's just too much force. So they're very, very dangerous because of that as well. Okay, here's a great picture too. I've told you that people thought airplanes should look like birds. Indeed, the Taube indeed looks like a bird. Probably didn't need to look like a bird, but it does. So the first time you'll see reconnaissance, which will be the most important thing in World War I, is on October 23rd, 1911, an Italian aviator. He is flying over Libya, and he will be the first person to use an aircraft militarily for reconnaissance. And he is flying over Turks. So there's a battle between the Turks and the Italians in what is today Libya. A lot of people use this plane. It wasn't just a German plane. They would sell them. The same with the Blériot was used by the French. The British had them all before the war. So they would just sell these things. So while they possess these aircraft, but aircraft are going to be sharing this role with balloons. So balloons haven't gone away. They're still very, very important for reconnaissance. But indeed, that will be the primary use of aircraft in World War I. Well, the other problem you have with aircraft is how do I communicate what I have found in the air? So I've seen troops marching, or I need to use artillery spotting. How do I communicate that? Well, there is really no good plan early on. This all has to be invented. And the French actually are the leaders in this field. The French are very, very ahead of everybody else in regards to how they are going to communicate information back. So perhaps what I would do is if I spotted the enemy and there was a field next to my command post, I would land on that field, get out of my plane, and tell them what was going on. I could handwrite scribble a message, put it in a little tube or a pod, and throw it out the airplane and hope somebody picked it up. I I could use colored flares. The French were big on that. They would also have the airplane fly in odd maneuvers over the command post to try to indicate what was going on that they needed to know. And none of this is really very, very effective. It's totally, really useless against artillery, to direct artillery. But you'll see that the airplane actually does, even with these primitive conditions, has some tremendous potential. Well, I said France is the aeronautic leader, and they are the first to institutionalize air photography. It's bulky. You can see in this picture of a British aircraft trying to take air photography. Yes, Kodak film has been invented, but the resolution of Kodak film is so poor that you can't use it for aerial photography. It's just not good enough. So there's a lot going on with trying to take a camera picture from an airplane, particularly at this time. It's very, very difficult. I'm trying to fly the plane. I don't have film, I have big glass plates. While I'm trying to fly the plane, I have to try to put this glass plate in and out to keep changing the film, in effect. And I have to fly really level, and I have to fly really exactly where I want to be and keep trying to take pictures. Well, I could do all that, but while I am doing that, am I paying attention to what's going on around me? Am I a big fat target? I sure am, because I'm flying level and straight and I'm playing with this camera. I'm not really paying attention to what's going on around. So it requires an incredible amount of skill and bravery to be a reconnaissance pilot. This isn't safe work. So eventually, by 1915, later in 1915, we start to put Marconi radio equipment into particularly artillery spotting aircraft. But there's a problem with this. The fact of the matter is this is all done by Morse code. They do not have the capability to put a sender and a receiver in these planes, so these planes have no receivers. So they don't know when they're sending information if the people on the ground are receiving the information, or if the people on the ground want more information, or whatever. They have no way to communicate. The only way they communicate is to lay strips of cloth on the ground, so when they fly over, they can try to get this pattern that tells them what they need to know. So we've got a lot of issues with primitive radio receivers even at this time. So there's certainly no voice radio. So the aircraft, though, like I said, is going to prove itself very early on in the war as an incredibly valuable tool. And how is this? Well, for example, at the Battle of Mons, which we talked about as the early part of World War I, the French Fifth Army is in retreat. They have not informed the British Army that they're retreating. A British aircraft spots the French Army retreating and the German Army advancing. This tells the British Army that indeed they need to retreat, and they begin their 200-mile retreat back to Paris. This saves the British Army from being destroyed. Next, in the same time frame, again, this is the first weeks of the war, a French aircraft sees a gap between the 1st and 2nd German armies. And this will lead to the attack at the First Battle of the Marne, which will save France from German defeat and defeats the Schlieffen Plan, which is the entire point of the German offensive. Again, an airplane does that. And then third, something we've not talked about in this class, but that is on the Russian front, you will see aircraft being used by the Germans, and they see a giant gap and a displacement of the Russian army, and that leads to the very famous Battle of Tannenberg, which is perhaps the most important, well, not important, but the most decisive single victory in World War I. They crush an entire Russian army. So the airplane, very, very early on, has been extremely important as a reconnaissance tool. Well, the airplane gets to be quite advanced as a reconnaissance tool. And I think, again, this is an amazing aircraft, not this one, but what the Rumpler Ruhbild. And the Rumpler Remember now, the Wright Flyer in 1903 could get to 10 feet off the ground. This Rumpler, by 1916, can fly at 24,000 feet. That's incredible technological advance for World War I. The Rumpler is so high flying, it is in effect the U-2 of its day. So it flies too high to be attacked by any other aircraft. So it's flying high, other aircraft are trying to get up to it, they can't reach it, they can't shoot it down, it's virtually invulnerable to counterattack. And it continues to take pictures. Great news for the Rumpler. It has got so high flying that they have to supply the pilots with heated suits and oxygen tanks. So again, by 1916, we're at this kind of altitude. It's pretty incredible. Well, cameras get much, much better. You see that we now have stereoscopic cameras, but we've got to learn how to really interpret this data. And in early, by World War I, they literally take millions of photographs. And they've got all these photographs, and really, they learn quickly that it's most important that a defense knows what's going on. So you can see through aerial photography if enemy forces are building up in one particular area. So because you see that buildup, then you know that that's probably where there's going to be an attack. So it becomes really important for aerial photography, primarily for defensive purposes. Well, so you got a zero base. Nobody has ever done this before. Nobody has ever interpreted photos taken from the sky before. So all this has to be learned. So if I take pictures, if I see you on the ground, I'm used to seeing that. When I look straight down on things, things look significantly different. Well, how do I tell how big things are, for example? Well, they learn to use shadows. So by the way a shadow is cast, I can tell roughly how large something might be. They have to interpret the data, and then they have to put this data in a format that people will understand. So if people are making data and they're all doing it individually, when I'm a general and I get a bunch of stuff in and it's all done by different people with different notations, I have no idea what some of these notations might mean. So all that has to be learned. So now I have to have consistent data. Everything has to be sent to me in the same manner. All this, again, needs to be learned because it's never been done before. And really, the static front of the Western Front, the fact that things weren't moving much, helps this out because, again, things will be consistent. They can learn this data more quickly, and it will help down the road, and it'll turn this, what is basically an art, eventually into a science of being able to use photo reconnaissance. Yes, Jim?
When did they develop the ability to use stereoscopic photographs? Was that after World War I?
No. They began to use stereoscopic photographs about 1915, 1916. So stereoscopic cameras became available at that point. Anyway, both sides learned to monitor their opponent. So in other words, we're going to keep a library of data. So I've got this data. I know if anything's been moved or people or things have changed. So if I took a picture last week and I see a picture this week and something's different, then indeed I've got a different issue there. I know something's going on. I can also begin to see the data used in ways like, we may remember talking about in tanks the whole tractor. Well, the tractor leaves tracks. So if I see a bunch of tractor tracks going somewhere into what looks like a pile of brush, I might think that there's probably an artillery piece in that pile of brush. So again, all this stuff has to be learned. And yeah, I think it's kind of sad, really, that these reconnaissance pilots never really get much credit. There are no reconnaissance aces. They never get much publicity. And yet they've contributed so much more really than anything else in World War I has contributed to these reconnaissance pilots as far as victory. So it's kind of a strange thing, but in a sense, but I guess the simplest way to look at it is it's much sexier to be a fighter pilot than it is to be a reconnaissance pilot. And just so you know, the reason I put this picture up to just remind us how far the United States is behind the rest of the world in aviation. In 1917, the United States is literally begging people of the United States to please sell them camera focal lenses of specific types, primarily Zeiss, which is a really outstanding German lens. So we're literally trying to buy lenses from our own population because we don't have any capability for aerial recon. All right, well, let's talk about fighter aircraft. I'm shocked that we'd probably want to hear about that. But really, at the start of World War I, there are no fighter aircraft. Our aircraft aren't really armed. There's a lot of cases very early in the war when two planes from the opposite side would wave at each other and, hey, you're flying a plane, I'm flying a plane, this is cool. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't end. That ends really quickly. And there is a Serbian, those of you historian types might know that the Serbians and the Austrians were not particularly friendly. Well, apparently a Serbian pilot made some, in quotes, gestures at an Austrian pilot. The Austrian pilot made some, in quotes, gestures back. And the Serbian pilot apparently took offense, pulled out a pistol, and began to fire at the Austrian pilot. The Austrian pilot just happened to be carrying a pistol as well and began to fire back. Neither side scores any particular hits, so the first known aerial combat comes completely ineffective, but it does show you what's going to be happening very soon. And what is that? Well, pretty soon I'm going to start carrying a rifle. Well, I'm going to carry a shotgun. Well, I got some darts I'm going to throw at your plane. Well, I got a grappling hook I'm going to try to tear your wing off with, right? And it finally gets to the point where the first known, I guess you would call this successful, aerial combat is a Russian pilot, Nesterov, in Galicia. He manages to crash into an Austrian observation plane. Both planes are destroyed. Everybody is killed, but it is indeed the first known aerial combat, even though it's not such a great idea to kill yourself doing it, I suppose. But the problem with these airplanes is trying to put a machine gun or something on, because these planes are very underpowered, let's face it. They're very flimsy. So if I'm going to add the weight of a machine gun, if I'm going to add the weight of a person to operate that machine gun, all this is going to slow my airplane down. So I'm going to have a lot of issues. Well, there's a lot of thought process goes into how to arm aircraft. But there's two types of aircraft. The first type we're seeing here is a pusher. In other words, the engine is mounted facing the rear. It's mounted in the rear, and it basically just pushes air back over the tail of the aircraft. This works really good for jets, not so good for propeller aircraft. The best design really is a thing called a tractor. In other words, the engine is mounted on the front, and it blows air over the wings and back at the entire aircraft. These are a much better design as far as propeller aircraft will go. The problem is it's much easier to arm a pusher aircraft than it is to arm a tractor aircraft. So first known use of a machine gun in war. Yes, the United States did test a machine gun on a Wright Flyer very early. I'm aware of that. But again, that wasn't a military use. That was just a test. He's a French pilot, and he blazes away with a machine gun on his aircraft. The British in 1912 decided the Vickers Company would make an aircraft that would be armed with a machine gun. It takes them basically until 1915 to create that weapon, and indeed it is the Vickers FB-5 gun bus, which is the first purpose-built fighter aircraft. Problem with it is it's a pusher, it's really slow, it can't catch anything. But it is indeed the world's first purpose-built fighter. Well, we really want to get a gun on a tractor-type aircraft. And you can see that this is actually probably the first real use of that. But these guns are a problem because they jam. They have most of them were drum fed, so so somebody could swing it around, so it's not got a belt fed machine gun. And the drums these machine guns would jam a lot. The drum only held roughly 47 rounds for a Lewis gun, for example. And it was better, obviously, to have a regular machine gun with a belt feed to get more rounds fired. But how do you do this? Well, Lenox Hawker, the first British ace, by the way, he decided to take his gun and mount it to the side of his aircraft, as you can see in this picture. And he mounted it on a 45-degree angle. And so that way he didn't have to shoot the propeller, and that way he had it designed so it wouldn't shoot into the struts of his aircraft. And he actually managed to shoot down 7 or 8, I can't remember exactly, German aircraft with this method. Now think about how awkward this had to be. You can only come in from this angle to shoot down an enemy aircraft. But he was a pretty good pilot, obviously, and made this thing work. Well, so early on, we know that the tractor aircraft need to have machine guns. Another option to do it, if the tractor aircraft had the right type of wing configuration, like this parasol wing here, then I could mount a machine gun above the wing and fire over the top of the propeller. Well, the early designs on this had some issues. For example, these guns have drums, so I have to then change the drum after a few shots, 47 roughly. I have to, if it jams, I have to stand up to fix the jam. If I change the drum, I got to stand up and fix the drum. It can cause some problems, and there's some cases where people had to do some amazing acrobatics when they nearly fell out of the plane trying to deal with this type of situation. And I'm sure there's some cases where people fell out of the plane and didn't actually survive because they were trying to fix that machine gun above their wing. Now later on in the war, the British will come up with a mount for their SE-5 where that gun can be slid down a bar. You can get at it while you're still in your seat and then slide it back up. But at this time of the war, that's not capable. What's the next big thing? It's going to be this. If you look at this propeller, you can see this is the propeller as if you're facing towards the engine. So I can see it looking back at me. And what they did was they put in these 2 metal tracks that are V-shaped. So when I fire the machine gun, some of the bullets are going to hit the propeller, but they're going to be deflected, hopefully, away from the propeller and away from me by these V-shaped troughs. And Roland Garros, who you might be familiar with, those of you that like tennis, he is the first pilot to really use this thing on a Morane-Saulnier. Now, the Schneider company, also of France, had developed an early version of an interrupter gear, which we'll talk about. But this is really the first practical design for a forward-firing machine gun. Well, practical is probably an exaggeration, but he's pretty successful shooting down Germans with this thing. And then one day, he has an engine failure. He is forced to land behind the German lines. His plane is captured, and the Germans are like, oh, this is cool. We got this technology, and we're going to use it. So the secret weapon of this deflector is indeed turned over to the Germans. Well, with that said, let's take a very short break and we will continue on with the development of the machine gun on aircraft. Well, when we left off, we saw we had a bunch of happy Germans, and they had captured Roland Garros's new secret weapon. Not very secret, really, if you think about it, but they thought this was a great idea, and they went to the Fokker company, who made a version of the Morane-Saulnier aircraft. So this made a lot of sense to them, and said, we want you to copy this secret weapon, this wonderful technology of putting metal braces on a propeller. And Fokker took a look at this thing and said, well, you know, this might work for the French, but, you know, you guys got a problem here you don't understand. Remember, Fokker's a Dutch guy. He's really not a German. And it's a Dutch company. I mean, he might have been a German. I don't know that, but it's a Dutch company regardless. So anyway, Fokker he looks at this thing and says, well, your problem is this, okay? The French ammunition uses a very soft coating over their lead bullet. German ammunition uses steel. So this little V-shaped rail you built on these propellers is not going to last very long firing steel ammunition at it. So he begins to reinvestigate the idea of the interrupter gear for it to be able to shoot through a propeller. And he perhaps infringes on a few of those Schneider patents from the French company, but you know, who can say? And he creates, by the spring of 1915, the first interrupter gear. So what is an interrupter gear? It allows you to shoot through the propeller by interrupting the flow of machine gun bullets so it misses the propeller. Pretty good technology, really, for World War I. And he creates the first push rod controller, or in German, Stangenströmung. And so basically the way this thing works is it interrupts the fire of the gun. Well, how does it do that? It has a cam. And we'll show you a picture of how this actually works in a second. And he puts it on this little aircraft that they've just developed called the Eindecker E3. Now, the Eindecker E3 is anything but a great airplane. It's really not a great airplane. It's not particularly fast. It's not particularly structurally strong. It's not particularly anything. In fact, it still even uses wing warping. So it's really not a very advanced aircraft. But the combination of his interrupter gear, the Spandau 08 machine gun, which is belt-fed and has a very reliable capability, and this thing becomes what's known as the Fokker Scourge. So this is a totally new creation in warfare in the air, because now I can aim the plane at the target. I have this capability now, and the plane now has a belt-fed machine gun that can shoot a lot more than that little drum could shoot. So this is a huge, huge advantage in aircraft. Well, how does this work? Well, okay, so if you look at the green enabler, here's your firing button. So what's going to happen is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this back. That's going to drop this cam follower down into the cam wheel. So that cam wheel's inside the engine and it's spinning. And every time that cam lobe hits the cam follower, it allows the gun to fire. And this is synchronized with the propeller. So every time that gun fires, it's not shooting the propeller off, it's missing the propeller. So now I've got the capability for a highly reliable machine gun that's belt-fed that won't shoot my propeller off. A lot of good advantages there, especially if you want to keep yourself alive. So it's really an amazing little piece of technology that he had created here. And if we actually want to see one, here is one actually connected to an Eindecker prototype. So you can see the rod goes into the engine spinning that moves the camshaft. Yes, Jim?
This is totally mechanical, no electrical at all.
This is totally mechanical as far as the camshaft goes. So that's totally mechanical, yeah. Okay, so if we look here, this is going into the engine, it's going up here. Here's the machine gun. It's connecting back into the machine gun and it's interrupting the fire. This is great. One problem. It's slowing the fire of the machine gun down. So this machine gun could fire at 500 plus rounds a minute. With the interrupter gear, it takes it down to 300 rounds a minute. So how do I solve that? Well, eventually, when I've got more powerful engines available, I will put 2 machine guns on it with double the ammunition, and now I will take it up to 600 rounds a minute because they're both synchronized.
How big is that ammunition and how much does it weigh?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
How big are the bullets or shells that it fires?
They're roughly 7 millimeter, like a 30-06.
Show me that. Oh, okay. And how much would a box of that ammo weigh? I'm just wondering about your load, because you got to hit a lot of ammunition in when you're firing at that rate.
It is limited. I couldn't tell you the exact weight off the top of my head. I would assume it's got some significant weight to it. I'll try and figure it out. I don't know off the top of my head. I'll see if I can track something down that says how much ammunition a Eindecker carried. I don't know. And then how much ammunition perhaps a SPAD would carry. I'll try to find it. Yes, Jim?
As you have fired your ammunition, your center of gravity or your pivot point on the airplane is going to change, so you have to take care of that in your trim. So
Yeah.
it's going to fly different once you discharge your ammunition and as you use gas. So it's no different than using up your gas. You just got to change the
Trim of the aircraft, certainly. But they don't have trim tabs back then. You got to control it yourself. Trim tabs ain't invented yet. So, anyway, yeah.
Are the belts made of fabric? Are the ammunition belts made of fabric?
Yes, at this time they were fabric generally. Metal links, I don't remember. I couldn't tell you the exact date when they came in, but I don't think they came in much before World War II.
What's a trim tab?
Oh, well, okay, that keeps your airplane in balance, okay, so it's like a little flap,
Oh, okay.
okay? So, yeah, that's not invented yet. All right, so one other thing while we got this picture up, please note how this propeller is bolted directly to this hub, and that whole thing has to spin to turn the propeller. I think that's kind of gives you a good picture of that as well. But again, that's how that worked. All right, so the first Victory was a prototype of this aircraft, the Eindecker E3. There was an Eindecker E4 too, by the way. And that is done by this Kurt Winkens, and he shoots down 2 French airplanes, but he gets no credit for them because they don't know he shot them down because they crashed behind French lines. It's only later, after the war, when they look at French records that we can see that indeed the first person to have success with the Eindecker is Kurt. Well, as we talked about the Fokker Scourge, the Fokker Scourge really takes place on August 1st of 1915, and some British aircraft decide to attack a German airfield. At this time, the Germans did not have fighter squadrons. They would assign a couple of aircraft for this purpose to reconnaissance squadrons. Well, this particular airbase had 2 really hot pilots. They had a guy named Max Immelmann and Oswald Bolka. And they are angry when this British attack comes. They jump into their brand new Eindeckers. They go chasing after them, and Immelmann managed to shoot down one of these British aircraft. The British go back to their command posts and go, hey, we got a problem. We were just attacked by airplanes that can shoot almost unlimited amounts of ammunition by coming straight at us. This is a problem, right? And as time goes on, more and more and more British and French aircraft are destroyed by these Eindeckers. Well, this causes a major problem with the British press. The British press decides that this is a disaster, and our pilots and aircraft become known to the British press as Fokker fodder. In other words, they have no chance against these aircraft. That's not necessarily true. It's probably really is definitely blown out of proportion by the British press. But the fact of the matter is it causes a huge scandal in Britain. And now there's a huge race on to get a synchronization gear on the British side as well. And it also has another effect. It creates the first of the great aces. And these people become incredibly popular figures. The first to win the Pour le Mérite is Max Immelmann. You could see that at his throat here. And the Pour le Mérite will then become known as the Blue Max because they name it after Max Immelmann, the nickname. Bolka, on the other hand, will be one of I believe the second, I'm not positive, but the second person to win the Blue Max, and he will become the father of fighter tactics. So as far as history goes, Oswald Bolka is much more important. So they're flying these new Eindeckers. They're having a great success. They're becoming rock stars, okay? These guys are like giant heroes in Germany. They're just incredibly popular. And they have what's referred to today as an ace race. Okay? The Germans never accept the 5 victories as making someone an ace. That's never accepted really by the Germans in World War I. The Entente powers actually create that number. They have different standards. The other standard the Germans have, which makes their aces very, very solid, is that in order to get claim for a victory, you have to shoot the plane down, and we have to see the physical carcass of the aircraft. So if it's shot down on the French side or the British side of the line, you get no credit. But if you shoot it down on our side of the line and we see the wreck, you get credit. So the German aces really are very well documented. And these guys continued to trade places back and forth with this ace race, and they're getting more and more notoriety with each victory. You could see Bulka's got his Pour le Mérite on, his blue max at the throat. And these guys, like I said, are just incredibly popular. Well, Bulka's gaining more and more experience. And he's a thinker. And he starts thinking, you know, there's a lot we could be doing as far as tactics and goes, because again, none of this has been invented before. No one has created this. So he starts thinking analytically how you could translate what he has learned into being fighter tactics. Well, Immelmann is killed in battle. And the Kaiser, because these guys are so incredibly popular, says, all right, Bulka's grounded. I want him grounded. I don't want him flying anymore. I'm not going to have another one of our top aces killed quickly. So he'll eventually go back to fighting and die, but he's initially grounded by the Kaiser himself. So he writes a thing called the Dicta Bulka. And this is not a Ditka, so those of you from Chicago, it's a dicta. Okay? And it's the world's first fighter manual. Well, he writes this thing and he says, okay, what we need to do is we need to not only have a manual, but we need to have a training school. We need to have squadrons of fighter planes, not 1 or 2 scattered here and there with recon units, but we need to have fighter plane squadrons. And he indeed develops all these things, and he takes command of what's known as the Jagdstaffel II. And Jagdstaffel would mean hunting squadron. So he is a hunter. And he is killed eventually after his 40th victory, which is a heck of a score. But he is killed by one of his own pilots that has a mid-air collision with him. So he's not shot down. He's a heck of a pilot. But 8 of his guys that are his initial group that go to his school and learn from him all become aces. Jasta II is one of the most effective fighting organizations in the German military. They shoot down over 300 enemy aircraft. They have they're considered, it's debated, but they're roughly a 12-to-1 victory ratio, so they shoot down 12 aircraft for every one they lose. They have 25 total aces that come out of this squadron in World War I. And those 25 aces account for 90% of the total victories from this squadron. We'll talk about that in a second. This is a typical trend in fighter aircraft. There's only a few aces, and they account for the vast majority of victories.
Brian,
Yes?
did you tell us what the German standard was? You said that
It varied throughout the war. What the question is what is the German ace standard? It varied. I believe
they had to shoot them over German territory.
Yes.
To verify.
to be verified. And I believe in order to get the Pour le Mérite, at one time you had to have 18 victories.
Wow.
Okay? That's to get the Pour le Mérite. They had different standards than the Allies. They didn't refer to aces as being, and in fact, they never used the term aces even in World War II. They referred to as experts. So here is the actual Ditka Bulka, not the Ditka Bulka. It is to secure advantage before attacking. If possible, keep the sun behind you. Always carry through an attack when you have started it. Here's the ace part. Fire only at close range and when you have your opponent properly in your sights. Aces are not necessarily great pilots. Aces frequently are great shooters. They know how to lead. They know they can anticipate the movement of the enemy aircraft, and they shoot well. Or the other thing is they're willing to get into point-blank range and make sure they get hits. This is the same attribute you'll see with ace submariners. Ace submariners would go in really close before they'd fire a torpedo because they wanted to make sure they got a hit. Their crews didn't necessarily think this was a good idea. All right, so don't be deceived. It's always to your advantage to assail your enemy from behind. I mean, some of this is pretty basic. If this is a good one, though, if you're being doved on, right, don't try to avoid it. Turn into it. So basically, you have a chance to fight back.
And your rate of closure
Is so bad, it's hard to hit. It's hard to get hits. Indeed, very smart on his part. Find a way to retreat. And when you're fighting in a squadron, make sure you don't gang up on one plane because then you get in each other's ways, or you might leave an opponent unattacked, and then that opponent is free to attack you. So it seems a little basic today, but again, nobody had ever done this before. Well, again, these guys are national heroes. Perhaps the biggest reason they become national heroes is because the common man sees as something romantic about these one-on-one sort of knightly duels for you medievalists out there. And it's such a difference from the hideous reality of trench warfare that the public really is very excited by this thing. But what happens with these aces is they fly far too long. They're in combat forever. And they start to get symptoms of PTSD. You can see it changes in their faces in pictures from when they start and when they're near the end of their careers. They all look very, very stressed. And day after day they fly. And remember, these aircraft have no self-sealing fuel tanks. They're made of wood and fabric. There's no armor. They frequently catch fire, and people frequently burn to death. So they watch their friends, they watch their enemies constantly burning on their way down and jumping out of planes, for example. And the very famous British fighter pilot, Mick Mannock, when he's told about Richthofen's death, he says, quote, "I hope he burned all the way down." 3 weeks later, Mick Mannock, making a mistake, flying too low to the ground, is hit by ground fire. His plane catches fire, and he jumps to his death rather than burn alive. So it's not pretty to be a fighter pilot by any of these planes, really.
Do they have parachutes?
No, they have no parachutes. We'll get there, though. So the most famous of all, and of course you can see he's wearing his blue max prominently, is Richthofen. And we refer to him as the Red Baron. He was not a baron, by the way. He was minor royalty, but he was not a baron. He flew a blood-red aircraft so everybody would know who he was. He was not afraid. He did not refer to himself as a pilot. He referred to himself as a hunter. He used to be quite a hunter as a young man. He would kill animals at a regular basis. And again, he's perhaps the most famous fighter pilot in the world. Snoopy certainly helped his career out, I'm sure. But the fact of the matter is he's a loner. He's a killer. He's a shot. He can shoot. He's not necessarily a great pilot, but he does make a mistake. And again, the stress is building and building on him. He flies too low. It is believed because of his autopsy that he was shot from below, so he was killed by ground fire, which has been The British Army claims they killed, or actually the Australians claim they killed him. And then before he crashes from being shot from below, he's barely flying along, probably already a dead man, and is hit from a Canadian pilot named Brown. So most people today think that even though Brown got credit for shooting down Richthofen, he was really killed by ground fire. And let's talk about ground fire. Yes?
Like I've seen painting a picture of the Red Baron plane and it had 3 wings. Is that right?
His last aircraft that he flew in was a Fokker DR-1. And the DR-1 was indeed a triplane copied after a British naval aircraft that was a 3-wing aircraft as well. It was generally, at that time, thought to be too slow, but Richthofen liked the aircraft. He probably should have flown something a little faster. Particularly, I don't know if the 7 was out yet, but certainly he could have flown he did fly versions of Albatross as well, but he was killed, yes, in a DR-1. But that's a triplane. So anyway, anti-aircraft artillery, you can see this Krupp gun from 1909. By 1909, we're already beginning to think about having anti-aircraft artillery, well before the war. Remember, the plane was only built in 1903, so the Krupps are pretty much ahead of this. So what's the idea of this gun is this gun's built with a special sight. So when I aim at the aircraft, the sight is designed to make the gun fire in front of the aircraft. So it leads it because the aircraft is moving. The problem is with this always is going to be is fuse setting. So I have to set a fuse in the shell so the shell blows up at a certain altitude. That's always pretty much issues. But by the end of the war, virtually every country is using AAA artillery similar to this idea. But there's no real experience doing this. And they really have a problem setting the range for these guns. So they don't know how fast the plane is going. They don't know how high the plane is. So it's difficult for them to gauge where they should set that fuse, even though they may have the offset properly. Because you're certainly not going to hit a plane in the air trying to hit it with a single artillery shell. So you want that shell to explode nearby and destroy the aircraft with shrapnel. So a lot of problems with this, except one case. If you're defending against balloons, because now I know the height of the balloon, and so I can estimate much more realistically what the height of the aircraft that's attacking the balloon would be. So anti-aircraft guns are extremely effective in defense against balloons, or defense for balloons, not against balloons, for balloons. So if I got a balloon and I want to keep that thing going because I need that balloon information, I will surround it with machine guns because the plane's going to come in low, and I will also surround it with anti-aircraft artillery. So balloon attack is extremely, extremely dangerous to aircraft. Well, balloons are still very, very important in World War I, and we've talked a little bit about this. And the balloons have changed. You can see this picture of what is known as a kite balloon. It's got almost a big rudder on it, and that's because you want to keep that balloon stable in the wind, and you have the capability then to have a better observation platform. Balloons are extremely useful because, unlike an aircraft, I can put a phone line in a balloon. So I can see the fall of shot from artillery, perhaps over a hill, and I can control that artillery directly with a phone line. Balloons do have some issues in regard to this, though, is that they are filled with hydrogen. That could be a problem. So I've got these balloons heavily defended because I need to keep them in line. I'm very important that I keep them. And the enemy really wants to destroy them. So if the enemy's going to try to destroy my balloon, they're going to pay for it. And there are pilots that are willing to take this chance. And they are known as balloon busters. And you would get the same credit for blowing up a balloon as you would get for shooting down an aircraft. So you would get your ace status that way for an Entente pilot. So Again, they're filled with hydrogen gas. So if you fire an incendiary round into one of these things, they go boom. But we are going to give our balloon observers parachutes, so they can jump out of the aircraft, out of this balloon when it catches fire and perhaps survive. Pilots are generally not given parachutes for two reasons. The parachutes are relatively large and bulky, and the second reason is it's thought that this will deter their fighting spirit. Now me, I would think that that pilot is a valuable asset and I would want to keep him alive. But apparently some people didn't think that way. So that brings us to Frank Luke Jr. And Frank Luke Jr. has always been a favorite of mine, and I'll tell you why in a minute. He has an incredible career. He is the second highest scoring U.S. ace. He is only second to Eddie Rickenbacker, and he is the first U.S. pilot to win the Medal of Honor, and he also has an air base named after him called Luke Air Force Base in Arizona. Now, why do I like Frank Luke? And it's not because his name is Frank. It's the fact that when I was a boy, across the street from us, there was a colonel, an Air Force colonel that lived across the street from us. And the Air Force colonel periodically would take me to Luke Air Force Base to get a butch haircut and to go see all the jets. And when I was a kid, this was like huge. I mean, this was like gigantic. All this, I'm going to get a haircut. So I would really enjoy that. Today I don't need a haircut much, but anyway, I was always fascinated with Frank Luke. So Frank Luke he's a warrior. I'll tell you, this guy, and what he's doing is he's got a pal, Joseph Werner, and these two guys make a team. So Joe is flying top cover for him to keep the fighters off him, and Luke would go in there and shoot down the balloons. And these guys are relatively, well, not relatively, they're really successful actually. And one day, actually September 18, 1918, the German fighters get his buddy Joe. He immediately breaks off the attack, goes in, shoots down two of these D-7 Fokkers, which is a very good aircraft. He shoots down a Halberstadt, and he destroys two balloons because he's angry. Now he goes on a tear because he's so angry that his friend has been killed. And he's basically, he's a madman. And he continues to shoot down planes and balloons at an incredible rate. He manages to shoot down 14 German balloons and 4 planes, 18 victories in only 8 days. No one surpasses that victory amount in such a short time in the entire World War I. Unfortunately, he goes after 3 more balloons and he's killed by ground fire. And it proves an adage by Chuck Yeager, who many of you might be familiar with, the famous test pilot and fighter pilot. And Chuck said, there's old pilots, there's bold pilots, but there's no old, bold pilots. So,
He died just 11 days after his friend.
yes, yes, he was just angry. But he was a warrior. I mean, this guy was, that's an incredible amount of victories in a short time. And to go when you're going after balloons, you're a crazy guy. Okay. Anyway, got to keep moving. Zeppelins, named after Ferdinand Zeppelin, not any rock band from the. They are. That's a little bad. I'm sorry. That was bad. Anyway, he creates this rigid, lighter-than-air craft. He is the first person to have a commercial air service. These things are good. I mean, they're really a huge improvement over, for example, Dumont's gas bag flying around the Eiffel Tower in a very short time. And like Kleenex, we now refer to any ship like this as a Zeppelin. So everything got that name, kind of like a dreadnought too. So anyway, the German army has, and the Navy both, buy these Zeppelins, and they begin to use them to bombard towns. They find out very quickly that the Zeppelin needs to maintain at high altitude because it's full of hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas has a tendency to explode when hit with an incendiary round, and they start to lose a lot of Zeppelins, so they keep them real high. So the German Navy was going to use Zeppelins, as you may remember in our class about Jutland. That changed because the winds were high. So again, these things are subject to a lot of damage from wind, lightning. They're not good in storms. You want to keep a Zeppelin in really good weather, so that makes them relatively inefficient. Early on, trying to shoot Zeppelins down over Britain, regular ammunition isn't particularly effective. So it just punches holes in, and they usually have enough gas reserve to make it back. So that's not a problem. But by 1916, the British have developed incendiary rounds, and at that point, the Zeppelin becomes a big liability. They're not survivable over England as a bomber. The Germans have 84 total Zeppelins. During the war, they lose 60 Zeppelins, but only really half of them are lost to military action. The rest are lost through accidents, primarily due to poor weather. So again, the Zeppelin's not reliable for this case. They have 51 raids. They drop 5,806 bombs. They kill 557 people. They injure 1,300. They cause about 1.5 million pounds worth of damage. Yes, they are a frightening terror weapon. But what they really achieve more so than the damage they cause is they force the British to take fighter squadrons from the Western Front that they could have been using to increase their air power and get air superiority and bring them back to defend Britain. So they really reduce the amount of firepower that the British have on the Western Front. Of course, they also cause some issues as far as panic. And it leads to people thinking later on that indeed terror bombing is going to be an effective morale weapon, and we'll see that in World War II. And if you look at this thing real quick, the Daily Mail, because we love capitalism, decides that they're going to cash in on the Zeppelin problem by offering you free insurance if you're a Daily Mail subscriber. So, for example, if you happen to be killed, we'll give you, if you're a subscriber, you get 200 pounds. If your spouse is killed, you get 200 pounds. If you lose either 2 limbs and 2 eyes, or 1 eye and 1 limb, you get 200 pounds. If you lose 1 limb or 1 eye, you get 100 pounds. If you lose a kid that's under 21, well, you get 25 pounds. Kids aren't that valuable. So basically, they're basically using the Zeppelin disaster to sell newspapers. I think this is kind of sad, but it's kind of funny at the same time.
You can only collect if you're a paid subscriber, so it's too.
Right, so they're selling subscriptions. That's the whole idea, okay? It's weird. But anyway, all right, so back to bombers. Finally got there. Again, there's that lovely Tauba, and the Tauba, of course, looks like a bird. The first bomber is going to be, again, an Italian flying over Libya, Giulio Gavati, and he decides he's going to take 4 4-pound grenades. He fits the fuses on them. He chucks them over the side. He doesn't hurt anybody, doesn't destroy anything, doesn't do anything really, but he gains the fame of being the world's first bomber pilot. Very nicely done. Again, attacking Turks in Libya. Tactical bombing becomes a very, very common thing in World War I. We start to see more and more aircraft are being designed specifically for this duty. So again, we're seeing a lot of development of this type of weapon. The next big thing will be the strategic bomber. And we're looking here at a Gotha G5. The Gotha G5 is intentionally built to bomb England, and it is a slow aircraft. They're 83 miles an hour. It carries a much smaller bomb load than a Zeppelin, but the fact of the matter is it's much more survivable than a Zeppelin. And these planes are really the first strategic bombers in history. So the Germans are losing the war. They're very, very close to being defeated. It's late in 1918. They come up with a plan with a new type weapon, which they refer to as the electron bomb. It's an incendiary. What they are going to do is they are going to take every bomber they have, fly them over Paris and London, and attempt to burn those two cities to the ground until either one of two things happen. The pilots are all shot down, or the pilots are too exhausted to fly. It's strictly a terror bombing. They have no other really strategic purpose than, in other words, to burn these two cities to the ground in order to force an end to the war on reasonable terms. So we can see by 1918 already this terror activity is starting to occur that will lead to total war. So they plan to do this in August. The German government basically backs down. They plan to do it in September. The German government backs down, and it is never done before the armistice on November 11th, 1918. But again, the plan to burn down cities is there in 1918. Probably the most innovative thing and the quickest thing is the use of aircraft is by the British Navy. The British Navy intends to raid Cuxhaven using aircraft that are dropped from seaplane carriers. So they don't take off the deck. They take them, winch them over the side, put them in the water. They take off, they land back in the water, they winch them back on board. When is this raid? Christmas Day, 1914. That's incredibly early to be planning a bombing raid. The weather is not good. They have major issues with the temperature. They can't get all the planes started. It's foggy. And the raid is only partially successful. But what it shows is that the British Navy is willing to use air power as early as Christmas of 1914 to have attacks against land and attacks against ships. And their primary purpose in this attack is to attack what? The sheds that house Zeppelins. So it's incredible that they would embrace this technology so early. So the British Navy really on top of the aircraft, probably much more so than the British Army was. Well, by World War I, the aircraft has definitely become a major component of militaries. We've seen it demonstrate its capabilities in reconnaissance primarily. That has been its biggest function in World War I. It has an effect on troops later in the war by strafing and bombing. We see it as the first use of tactical air power. And the Navy, by August of 1915, the British Navy drops a torpedo from one of these primitive aircrafts and sinks a Turkish warship. Cargo ship. And by 1915, that's amazing. And we'll see the torpedo drop from an airplane become such an important part of World War II. So all this technology is building. The Furious, which is converted from a battle cruiser to an aircraft carrier, launches the first carrier strike in July of 18. And we see things like fighter squadrons now are used for air superiority and for defense. We see strategic bombers, which of course will lead to the strategic bombing of World War II. And the advocates of this all come from this period. Duhay, Billy Mitchell, Hugh Trenchard, they all commanded aircraft in World War I. And they could see that the improvements made in World War I and the improvements that were going to be made in the interwar period were going to make them convinced that the bomber was the most important possible weapon there was in the world. And they were convinced, and I'll get ahead of myself a little bit, that the bomber will always get through. It could not be stopped. And these guys will be the ones that plan the major strategic offensives of World War I. So we will start again next week with Between the Wars, and thank you all for coming.